for joining us this evening as we explore the importance of maps, but a very special map that we're going to take a close look at very shortly. And thank you to all of our very special guests who are going to be speaking this evening. I will leave them to introduce themselves, but first, a little bit of typical Zoom housekeeping. First off, if you have not already muted yourselves, I ask that you please do so that we don't have any ambient noise sort of popping up through the program. And secondly, in order for optimum viewing, you will see in the top right of your screen, there's a little view button, and I suggest that you select speaker view, and this will allow whomever is speaking to show up larger on your screen. When we have all our speakers speaking together, I'll make sure that they are all visible at the same time. I want to say a brief but very sincere thank you to Maddie Dugan for helping make our Zoom programming possible. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Carol and our special speakers for this evening. But again, thank you all so much for joining. And we will have some time for Q&A at the end. But if you have questions throughout the program, feel free to put them in the chat box below at the bottom of your screen. There's a little chat icon, and you can address them either to me, Alexandra Schneider, and I can read them out at the end, or you can address them to the speakers more broadly. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Carol.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for attending tonight. This is the kickoff to what is going to be a 5-month exhibit at the History Center on maps of Lake County. And we explore several topics within that exhibit. We would love for you to come. Tomorrow night is opening night. If you would like to be there, hours are 6 to 8. Is that correct? All right, thank you. Yeah, 6 to 8. And the exhibit will be running, like I said, up until probably early November. We are open Tuesday through Thursdays from noon to 4, and then Saturdays from 1 to 4. And we are also open by appointment should you want to come through with a small group or on your own. Just give me a ring. So I would love to introduce our panelists for tonight's discussion. We have Jim Akerman, who is head of the maps collection at the Newberry Library, and he's going to tell you a little about that collection. Art Miller from the Lake Forest Preservation Society, who was for a very long time also the archivist over at Lake Forest College, and Heather Johnson, curator at the Dunn Museum. And part of the reason that we've gotten this collection of people together to talk is because we all sort of took part in the effort to move the 1857 map of Lake Forest from City Hall. Preservation had it restored, and then the Dunn Museum and the History Center lobbied for it to move to the Newberry Library, where we knew it would be held in great preservation capabilities. And so one of the things we want to talk about today is what the value is of that map, why it was so important, and why it's important to have it at the Newberry. And then we're going to have Jim and Heather talk about their collections and the sort of things that you, if you're interested in maps, that you will find in their collections. So with that, I would like to start with Art, who can kick us off with a little framing. Art's setting up his PowerPoint, and then he has to unmute. You are on mute still, Art. Unmute, please. All right, I just lost Art altogether. All right, so he might have accidentally disconnected. Oh no, they're, okay. He's wandering around. All right, so in the meantime, I'm going to do color commentary, which is what I promised if we had any technical glitches. So the 1857 map, if you have not seen it, we actually have a replica of it at the History Center right now. We sort of explain what the story is that that map tells. It is not the most beautiful map. It's not a colorful map, but it is a map that is particularly important to the history of Lake Forest and larger to sort of city planning. So Art, do you need me to coach you through again how to get to share screen? All right, Art is now frozen. Oh wait, I have Art on two things. Okay, you're still on mute, Art. Okay, Art, we can't hear you, and I don't think he can hear us. Sorry about that, technical glitch.
No, sorry. Switched computers. So I'm not going to do the PowerPoint things, but you you will be able to, I'll orient you to it. But basically the Lake Forest Plan, which was done in 1857, was done by Elmer and Hotchkiss. He was hired after they had picked the site. The first thing always is a classical site. That had been done in 1857 or 1856 by the Lake Forest Foundation or Lake Forest Association. They bought the land. They bought more land actually than Hotchkiss used entirely. And he made his whole he focused his plan on 285 lots east of the railroad tracks in a very irregular area. So he selected a plan. Started first with the beach park, the long tableland on the lake, and then to the west of that directly, he positioned the station along the original 1855 completed railroad system, and that was his basic plan. There are different versions of the plan. The first version that was published came from a St. Louis outfit that did a Lake County map, and they did an inset that showed the little village of Lake Forest in 1861. And if you look at the map, it was like looking at a Sesame Street. Which of these things is not like the others? Because everything was the 1787 grid plan of the Northwest Territory, and the problem was that it was really quite a different looking thing. It was hard for the surveyors and everything, but Elmer and Hotchkiss laid it out as one of the very first Garden City plans of a Garden City plan that was transport enabled. The first ones go back to the ferry boat that crossed from Liverpool to Birkenhead in 1836. That was the first transport enabled little garden suburb. And a few of them grew up, but this was the largest by far by the time it came along. So the problem is the people actually who lived here didn't publish the plan until 1869 themselves. And the plan hasn't gotten a whole lot of publicity over time. It started to get publicity after 1988 when Michael Ebner published it in his book about creating Chicago's North Shore. The University of Chicago Press, that has a good copy of it in there. So it's received more interest in that time, but there's no real clear sequence of how these all developed. So the good part is that what we have is a plan. Now, when David Mattoon, who was doing research for the train station, got interested in all of this about 2009, helping with things for it, he turned to who owned the land in about 1914 and actually did quite a bit of research on that. And in trying to figure that out, ended up trying to create a new map from a 1943 replica. He and a Professor Bailey Donnelly of Lake Forest College photographed it, created, and he recreated plans so that he could make one plan that had good numbers for all the lots, the 285 lots east of the lake. And then he could also create one that showed the colors, because like on a checkerboard pattern, they divided up the lots into ones that were yellow that were going to go to the university, the proceeds, and pink were going to go to the Lake Forest Association to put in little details like the roads, the bridges, and perhaps also to build a little hotel. So that happened, and he showed that on his maps and created that. But I was sort of scratching my head at that point, because in the 1990s, I'd seen a larger plan at the city municipal building, and we sent them off to hunt for it. I said, I'm sure you have it. The kicker in this is that they had actually moved the municipal services operation from one building to another. And so that made it a little more complicated. Here we go. There's the plan. So this is the actual, this is the restored plan that we found. So when they were looking, they couldn't find the one that I remembered seeing, but they found this one. This one was kind of bedraggled, but it was in a beautiful frame. And it was then figured out by David Mattoon, looking at it, that at the bottom of the plan, there is an excellent, there's some, you can see some markings there. Everybody wrote what they did or what role they had in approving it at the county building in July of 1857. And David looked at it and figured out that this actually was the original registration copy of the plan. What had happened was that in 1895, just before the Enwencia Club was formed, in April of 1895, the city of Lake Forest complained to the people at the, they actually complained to the people at the county that they were having a hard time registering all the lots for people who were coming out to play golf and buying property because the plan was so bedraggled. And so they wanted to have a new one done up. And when they finished it, then the county gave them the old one as kind of a memento. So this was the original plan that was registered in 1857. It's the closest we get to Hotchkiss's plan. It's drawn by Bixby, the fellow who was the surveyor. And typically these plans have been credited to surveyors, but we know from the minutes of the Lake Forest Association that this was actually St. Louis's Almer and Hotchkiss doing this. He actually received one of the lots as payment. There was a kind of a cash shortage following a little panic that they'd had in the economy in 1857. Thank God we never have any of those anymore. And so cash was short, but he got a lot. So we know that he was the designer. And so you can see down there the kind of writing that was going on, the different judges and things were putting that in. And so we know that this was that actual copy. So it was sent off to the Conservation Laboratory in Chicago for basic stabilization. It was faded, it had been exposed to light, it was the materials and all had degraded, the colors had been lost from sunlight exposure and things. So but it was put into a beautiful oak frame, and the city used it apparently in the city hall. They got it back in 1895. City Hall was open in 1899, and it probably got more exposure in this beautiful frame at that time. It ended up so being though sidelined, and then didn't turn up until 2014 after David and I were rooting around at City Hall, and they started looking seriously and found it. David and I gave a talk with good slides in the City Hall at that time, and we were able to give a pretty good account of how it had come about. So what happened was then when the city decided they wanted to move it, if it wasn't going to be in City Hall where it was originally supposed to be, where would be the best place? And what it needed, because of its special character, was to be in a place where two things would happen. One, it would get the best care possible. Two, it would get the attention because of its location in the Newberry Library. The Newberry Library has a fantastic map collection. The map collection was built gradually over the years, but many different kinds of things have fed into it. But it had the Hermon Dunlap Smith Map Center for research there, which was created in about 1972. Hermon Dunlap Smith lived on the lake in Lake Forest, was a great map collector, lots of maps of our region. So this was a totally logical place for it to go. So 15 minutes before the pandemic, just a few 15 months ago or so, 15 minutes before, on March the, I think it was the 12th or 8th or something like that, 10th, probably the 10th of March in 2020, it was transferred down to the Newberry Library. And then just like a giant thing closing down. Everything closed down. And we're now, here we are after the pandemic, picking up again, picking up the thread, and the Newberry's had it. And that's sort of how it got there. It had an interesting history of how it was created. It was used at the county building for about a little less than a half a century. Then it came back to the city of Lake Forest, but at some point went into storage because it was, I guess, didn't fit or whatever, because it was pretty large. And then it's been resurrected again for a very brief period, a few years. It was actually on display in the city hall, framed and stabilized. And now it has been transferred to the Newberry Library.
Okay, and I think with that, we can turn it over to Jim, who can pick up on part 2 of that story.
I will unmute myself and then I will share my screen. Okay. Can you all see?
We can.
All right, and I will start the slideshow. Okay, so there's sort of 2 parts to this talk. First, a very brief introduction to the Newberry's map collection. And if you haven't wandered down there, at some point, I would encourage you all to do so. We have reopened after the pandemic, but you have to make an appointment to use the reading rooms. However, there are exhibit galleries that are currently open. And it's a beautiful, beautiful late 19th century building in a nice part of the city. So worth going down there. And I want to stress that it is a public, it is open to the public. You don't have to have a PhD to use the research collections here. You just have to have an interest in doing them, in doing research. But because of the restrictions right now, you have to make an appointment to do that. And I would just say before I forget, if you are interested in learning more about our map collection, I encourage you to reach out to me at ackermanj@newberry.org, and I can put that in the chat when we're done, so you can find that. So the Newberry's been in existence since the late 1880s, and I do agree, as curator of maps, that we have a fantastic map collection. It's been my great privilege for the last 35 years to promote it and frankly to play in it and with it for a long time. I'm extremely lucky. The collection spans from the late, like the collections of the Newberry, spans from the late 15th century all the way up to the 21st century. We have some real great early modern treasures, as well as things like AAA triptychs that we've acquired since we've got a strong interest in modern road mapping as well. So, and just about everything in between, but with a focus on Europe and the Americas. Just a couple of our better known treasures or lesser known treasures. This is a map by, not by Hernando Cortez, but produced as a result of the Cortez conquest of Mexico, published in 1524. Showing Mexico City, which really was something that astonished Europeans at the time. Some say it was the largest city in the world up to its conquest. An early woodcut map of the world. Woodcutter was a fellow named Albrecht Dürer, and this was made about 1511. We have a fine collection of early modern geographical atlases, such as this the map of the world from an edition of Claudius Ptolemy's Geography. This is one by Bernardo Silvanus, done in 1511, on something called a cordiform projection because it's heart-shaped. Several editions of this map, one of the most famous maps in American history, John Smith's map of Virginia, which is a pretty good rendering of Chesapeake Bay, and which relied intensively on indigenous information to produce it. a map of the Mississippi Valley by Guillaume Delisle from 1718, which has a little place called Chicago shown up here at the tip of Lake Michigan. Several editions of this map, including the manuscript on which it was based. This is a map produced on the official publication of the Lewis and Clark expedition. A lot of maps related to travel in the 19th century, maps that were produced for immigrants to the Midwest, for example, of which this is a representative. The second part, so that's a very quick overview of the Newberry's collections, and believe me, I have probably 10,000 slides that I could show you from this collection that I've collected over the years. But I wanted to talk a little bit about why we're so glad to take this, to accept this very generous gift. Take sounds too aggressive. To accept this generous gift of this plan of Lake Forest from 1857. It is a landmark and of the relationship between mapping and urban planning or suburban planning, as the case may be, and coming in the 19th century, which was a kind of golden era for the beginning of modern urban planning. Culminating in the production of the Plan of Chicago by Daniel Burnham in the early 20th century. Urban maps were probably the most common type of map that circulated in early modern Europe. And I would estimate that roughly 50% of the printed maps that were produced in Europe up to the 16th century were related to urban areas. And part of the reason for this was the close association in that time between mapping and urban sieges and the planning of fortification. When you started building these tremendous walls to close off to protect against cannon fire, you needed to spatially plan the city very carefully. So this gave a real impetus for the production of maps that were related to military fortifications. And these were translated into popular publications such as this atlas by Brown and Hagenberg from the late 16th century. Other urban maps, such as this famous map from 1500 of Venice, were propaganda pieces promoting civic culture, and in this case, promoting the power of Venice as a commercial and maritime power. Other maps were related to cities' attempt to recover their history, such as this map from the mid-18th century, which shows the modern city of Rome at that time, which is the darker shaded area, surrounded by all the monuments of the ancient city. And in a way, it was set the tone for Rome reimagining itself in the later modern era and to become a reborn city of great growth and expansion. A famous view of several examples I'm just going to show you of how mapping is related to reimagining the city. This is a plan that Christopher Wren drew up after the Great London Fire of, 1660, I want to say, which is a plan for rebuilding the medieval city of London, which unfortunately was never followed, and it went back to its former medieval chaos. And a tremendous role of mapping in planning out colonial cities. And in the United States especially, but in many other parts of the world, the fascination with the grid as a kind of egalitarian way of representing, a way of dispersing land on an egalitarian basis. That was very much on the order of what William Penn was thinking about for Philadelphia. Or the idea of remaking a classical city, which was which was guiding L'Enfant's plan for Washington, D.C. Even Joseph Smith was an urban planner. Many of the Mormon cities were laid out according to a grid that followed very closely a certain notion of religious ideology and ideal cities, such as Zion, which is a city that never really came to be. Railroads were also interested in using plans to lay out towns along their railroads in order to facilitate the construction of towns that would receive immigrants to those areas and provide, in turn, more money for the development of the railroads. Throughout the history of the city of Chicago, the grid is something that's very well defined. This is something that came originally from the Northwest ordinances of the 1780s, which ordained that the old Northwest territories were going to be laid out by these 36 square mile townships to facilitate the growth of rural land and the settlement of rural land. But this is also what influenced the basic Chicago grid. Cities like Boston turned to the grid as a way of expanding when they were hard-pressed to find land within their old medieval bounds of the old Shawmut Peninsula. And grids were a way of expanding as these industrial cities of the mid-19th century grew. And the need for urban planning was very well developed in places like Paris, where Baron von Haussmann famously laid out not only expansions, but plowed through the old medieval cities to lay out these boulevards that would dictate the way the city would be laid out. Chicago, because of its tremendous growth, it was the most rapidly growing city in the world at the end of the 19th century, was also very much involved in the innovations in urban planning and the planning of spaces, and metropolitan planning for that matter. The famous green belt of towns, of parks that were around the edge of the original city were planned by such great names as Olmsted and Vaux. And you will notice the parklands that are laid out from that. It would be reminiscent of the kinds of things that you would find in suburban plans around the edge of the city, where the idea was to abandon the grid and the regimentation and return to a kind of pastoral, almost romantic view of how cities were going to be laid out. Unfortunately for Lake Forest, Olmsted's plan of River Forest has gotten all the international attention, even though it didn't come to be until 1859. And this plan preceded it by 2 years. So you rightly claim a certain pride of ownership for this plan, which is characteristic of this notion that you're going to lay out these suburban communities as a kind of romantic, idyllic landscape. Burnham famously was recasting Chicago in the image of Baron von Haussmann. Didn't succeed very well in laying out those plans, except along the parklands where they could add land to the lakefront and do a lot of the work that was needed along the plan. But I wanted to talk just a little bit more about another reason why we're very anxious to have this. We were very anxious to have this, is that we consider ourselves as one of the great places where metropolitan history of Chicago is preserved, and our map collections are representative of this. I'm sure you're going to be seeing in this exhibition how a series of maps can show so well the way particular communities are laid out and grow. And we can trace through maps the tremendous growth that Chicago went through in the latter part of the 19th century, all the way to and the role that the railroad played in providing accessibility of suburban communities and recasting the way metropolitan areas were thought of throughout the world. And I'll just skip to the end because I don't want to take too much of this time. I'll just throw in one other aspect of the collection that we have. We have a great collection of travel materials, including this wonderful view of photographic, the route of photographs. Photographs were made in 1909, tracing the route from Chicago to Milwaukee by showing turn-by-turn instructions, much like your in-car navigation system, or more properly your cell phone would be doing these days. But this was all done with photographs, and I presume glass negatives are something that had to be set up, and the tripod had to be set up at each turn. I did happen, as I was preparing today, to come across a page which shows you entering the city of Lake Forest. So if you want to get an idea of what Sheridan Road and Waukegan Road and other roads in your area looked like at that time, here it is. With that, so I see this map as something that really animates what I think is an emerging field in the history of cartography, which is the study of this relationship between mapping and planning, and probably just as important as a way of preserving the history of the entire metropolitan area. We have great facilities for maintaining and promoting the use of this map, and we were very glad that as citizens and officials of the city of Lake Forest were willing to entrust it to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. That was great. That's a lovely setup. So what we want to do is then kick this over to Heather Johnson from the Dunn Museum, because one of the things I want to make sure that, in the course of over the next 6 months with the History Center is that we sort of highlight where there are very strong map collections. And if it is something you're interested in, understanding where you can go for different information. So Heather, I will turn this over to you so that you can start your presentation.
Of course, the Zoom controls are right on top of the controls for my program here. Oops. Okay. All right, so I'm Heather Johnson. I'm a curator at the Bess Dunn Museum of Lake County, and we're in Libertyville. And we used to be the Lake County Discovery Museum in Wakanda, so some of you may know us from there, but it's the same museum, same collection, just a new location. And we have a pretty good sized map collection that focuses, of course, on Lake County and its communities. And our best known map is probably the 1861 Plat map, because we recently had it restored and we did a little publicity and some social media posts about it, and it appears on some merchandise in our stores, so people kind of know what that is. We had it restored. We sent it to James Toomey's Book Restoration Company up in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So the picture on the left is the before and the picture on the right is the after. And it had been donated to us rolled, and we had kept it stored rolled because we were a little afraid to try to unroll it ourselves because of the condition. So you can see it was deteriorated with age, and it had some kind of coating on it that had discolored over the years. So the restoration really took care of a lot of that. And here's a close-up of some of the tuning they did to it, the really careful work they did piecing the flakes back together and sealing up the cracks in it, so we didn't lose any information on the map. So it turned out pretty good. And the 1861 map is kind of neat because it's a pretty early map of the county. I think there's only one earlier that's technically sort of a Plat map style. And 1861, when you think about it, is also the start of the Civil War. So it's a neat sort of mile marker in the county's history and in the nation's history, because after the Civil War, the development of the county shifted dramatically. So having this as a comparison for what happened after the war is kind of a neat thing. And Art mentioned earlier about the Lake Forest plan being on the map, and indeed there is a detail in the border of the 1861 map that shows Lake Forest with the streets that are clearly influenced by that plan and laid out here on the map. So our Plat maps, like this 1861 Plat map, are probably our most utilized maps of the ones that we have because they're really good, accurate resources. They're done to scale. The information came from official surveyors. They show the legal divisions of the land, and they show the names of the landowners. So they're a really good research tool and very reliable research tool. So in our history archives, we have a wide range of years, which is nice because you could compare changes from year to year as you are doing your research. And we also have the 1965 Aero Plat atlases that were given to us by the Lake County Map Department. And those were where they took aerial photos of Lake County and then sort of overlaid a map over them. So you're seeing the real photos and the map at the same time. So those are kind of neat. And all of our maps are very accessible and available for research. So we have the original maps, but we also, years ago, before digitization was really a thing, photographed our older maps. So they're available for researchers who come in. They can flip through them, lay them out on the tables, put them side by side to do things. So they're very accessible and easy to handle when you're doing your research. And of course, we can always pull out the originals if needed and provide high-res images if people require those. So the maps get used pretty frequently for researchers. We get requests from people who are doing site surveys before developing a piece of land. They might need to know what was there before. Was there industry there, where they have to worry about what might have soaked into the soil? Do they need to do an archaeological survey? Those sorts of things. We actually use them all the time for our own research. My colleague Diana Dretsky and I were talking before this presentation about how the maps provide a really good way to sort of pull back and get a bird's eye view of the county and the history. You can trace the settlement patterns, see the development of the land and the roads. You can see towns grow or disappear sometimes. So it's a good way to get this bigger view of trends in settlement and what's happening in the county. And then you can also use them for smaller, more fine-tuned research. So for instance, we have in the collection a series of diaries from the Minto family who lived in Antioch Township. And I'm showing you a snippet of the 1885 plat map. This is a snippet from Antioch Township. So the Mintos are there in the middle, right on Loon Lake. And they were about equidistant between Antioch up in the upper left-hand corner and Milbourne down in the bottom right-hand corner. And the diaries cover a span about 1860s to the early 1900s, basically just describing their everyday farm life. So it's a really great picture of just rural life in Lake County over a period of time. So viewing the maps alongside the diaries, because they cover such a span of time, just adds this whole other dimension and really brings to life what you're reading in the diaries. You can see where their land is, how it's oriented on the lake. So when they talk about going back to the lake, you can kind of visualize them doing that. You can see the distances to different places. They talk about going to Antioch. And when you trace the roads, you can see that to get there, they either had to go down and around or up and around the lake. Versus Milbourne, which is more of a diagonal route. So Milbourne naturally became more of their home base. That's where they went to church and went to community gatherings. And so it's a little bit closer. And it's a really great way to see who their neighbors are. So the diaries are always talking about who they were visiting, who they were helping on their farms. And you can see all the neighbors laid out here on the maps and where they were in relation to the Minto farm. And also when we were transcribing these handwritten diaries, sometimes the names were a little hard to read or they were spelled phonetically. And so we would go to the maps and try to guess, which neighbor best fit it and then narrow it down until we get the, figure out which neighbor they were probably talking about and get a better spelling for our transcription. So it was a really good resource for that. So I'll just give another real quick real life example of how our maps get used. So genealogy is another thing that for the plat maps are a really good tool for. So the plat maps, if your person is a landowner, are a good resource for genealogy, and they actually kind of complement the census records because they tend to fall in between the census years. So the maps can provide another data point for you when you're tracing where your ancestors were. So we had a family come in and they'd done their family tree already and traced their ancestors using the usual tools like Ancestry.com. And they knew that they had been in Deerfield Township for a time. So they came in and we pulled out the plat maps, and sure enough, we could see all the family names laid out there in Deerfield, which was really neat for them. And they could just suddenly have this very tangible link to their ancestors, and to see where they lived and to actually see them on the map was really neat for them. And it also sort of showed them how some of the branches had ended up linking, because of course all these names are in the family tree because of marriages. And so seeing that the Dorseys up in the upper left-hand corner and the Sullivans around the I in Deerfield were so close to each other explained why a few generations later there was a marriage between these two families. So it was just a really neat way to kind of put all those pieces together. So all of this is just to say that I think that a map can be almost as good as a photograph when you're trying to illustrate your history, and that they're a great way to add an extra dimension to your research and add that visual connection that we're often looking for.
That was excellent. Thank you so much. All right, so we'll move into sort of a general conversation, and Alex, if you can spotlight us so that's easier for those to see. There we go. And let's start with, we've got a lot of amateur collectors that are sort of out in the community. if we're talking to them, what are some of the things you would love for them to know, both about their collection, about sort of preservation, maintenance, and then the legacy aspect of that, should they decide they no longer need them? We'll start with Jim.
Okay, well, I will say that I will say that the Newberry often receives gifts from private collectors. It's one of the things that you might want to do to get some guidance about whether in an institution like the Newberry or the Historical Museum would be interested in your collections, is to reach out to the curators. Curators, we have a curator of modern manuscripts. We do collect books. One thing that we will tell you is that collections are do also take up space in the institutions that they receive them. So it's important to get an idea of from them what from these curators, what would be the things that institutions are willing to take. We have at the Newberry, for example, a lot of collection, what we call collection development policies that dictate what kinds of things we have and what kinds we do not. But I would also say not just to think in terms of giving to materials, but these curators can be an important resource for you to direct you to kinds of materials that the collections have that can complement your interests, or which can provide some guidance and literature that tells you a little bit more about what you have. And I'm not just thinking about family papers, I'm also thinking about book collections you might have, or what the heck map collections that you might have. We're always a resource that can be helpful to you.
Sounds great. Heather, anything to add to that?
I would just add some practical tips. If it's folded up, unfold it and store it flat, because anywhere there's a fold is going to create a weak point in your map where you might eventually see it separating. And then, Art had talked earlier about how much damage light had done to the plan, and that can happen to your maps too. So if you're displaying them, just be aware of how much light they're getting, make sure they're not in direct sunlight, that sort of thing.
You
And
can,
Art.
yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
Go ahead, Jim.
I was going to say you can get, if you're going to have maps, for example, framed, you want to look into having a glass that's UV ultraviolet filtered, which is a great way of shielding it from the light. Yeah.
To an extent.
Yes, right. Within limits. Yeah, right.
It'll wreck it if it's not in a protected kind of setting. So, yeah. I mean, it is a very careful thing. Lots of people in Lake Forest, for instance, over the years, there have been waves of things, and they've gone to various libraries, Chicago Historical Society, Newberry Library, certainly like the case of Mr. Smith, who was a major donor there. But lots of people have smaller collections. They aren't quite sure what to do. And so sorting through where the best locations are, condition is a factor, usability, access, who is it most interesting to? If it's a really purely local thing, maybe it's not interesting enough for the Newberry Library, but it would be better at the county or local level, like at the History Center for sure. And Lake Forest College has quite a few maps, but they aren't so much focused on local necessarily. It's a big Scottish collection, so bunch of Scottish maps there. So it depends on, finding out what particular niche things fit into.
Well, and that's one of the things Jim, I loved your presentation. I thought that was really interesting. It's something that we at the History Center are constantly thinking about, which is, what are the stories our collections tell, and how do we link them together in a way that's cohesive and helps people really understand why we collect what we collect? And for us, one of the things that we're always looking at is the sociology of community development. Why here? Who comes? Why do they come? When do they come? How does it change? And how do you create or destroy a sense of community? And what are some of the things that Lake Forest and Lake Bluff have done to sort of, keep the community cohesive. And maps, as Heather was saying, are great tools. They are as good as photographs for being able to see growth patterns, where the business districts are, who lived where, subdivisions, roadways. There are all these interesting things that come out of the map collection that when you look at them side by side, start to tell a story over time. And so I loved Heather, where you were going with that idea that they're almost like a travelogue of the land that talks about sort of how it's formed and changed. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, no, I think that sums it up really nicely. Yeah, it's great to start comparing those differences and see those trends. And, we have a lake here in Libertyville, Lake Meniere, that appeared sometime in the 1930s, and we were trying to pinpoint when it appeared. And so we turned to the maps, and, in the 1920s, 1926 map, it's not there. And then in a later plat it is. And we finally ended up being like a really local map that the Historical Society had. We narrowed it down to, I think, about like a 7 or 8 year span of when it probably popped up in the town.
One of my favorite sections in the new exhibit that we've got opening tomorrow is on how maps were used as marketing tools. That they were as much propaganda, particularly between like 1900 and 1950, as anything was. And that there were, between travel and between trying to sell space and get people to come to your community, maps were used as sort of this fascinating narrative around the grand and glorious whatever. It was when we were doing the research on, and this will tie to what Jim's doing with travel in the US, the exhibit that they're working on, the Lincoln Highway was one of the first transcontinental highways, which was functionally an association that said, hey, if you pay me enough, I'm gonna put you in my catalog. And so literally it is anything between huge paved roads and dirt paths cross country. And there's actually, you wander around for 100 extra miles across Utah because they were so willing to pony up to be on the Lincoln Highway, because it brought people into town. And it's this sort of fascinating snapshot of how America develops. I mean, that's one of the other things I love about these maps, is that although, what we do is we tell a very local story, it is emblematic of a much larger national narrative. So I don't know if anybody wants to pick up on that thread. Art?
Another category that's like that's like the auto maps, of course, is the railroad maps. And Lake Forest College also has a railroad collection. So some of these railroad lines, they developed to very different purposes. Some were just to get across the country as fast as possible. But like the Chicago Northwestern, that was kind of headquartered around here, they went to every like Middlesex village and town across Iowa, South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin. They weren't just trying to get someplace, they were trying to pick everybody up. And comparing how some of these different maps, if you look at these maps, you see very different ideas about how to run a railroad.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, you saw at the beginning of my presentation a lot of early modern maps, which have been sort of part of the canon, the way map history was researched and taught until the late 20th century. There's been a lot more attention, first of all, just to what's going on in the 19th and 20th centuries, but also just to the very much more human side of maps. And the ways that maps are used to persuade is part of that. But I love some of my favorite maps that we have in our collection are maps, and some of the things that I'll be featuring in this exhibition we're doing next year are maps that I can tie to a particular user, where somebody has taken a map, or let's say a road map, or we have this marvelous guide to the California Trail that somebody has inscribed his daily journey across the West, day by day, where he was each place. And I just love that, the way that maps can tell stories. In the early modern era, very few people really saw maps. One of the things that's wonderful about the 19th and 20th centuries, especially in a very literate society like the United States, is that everybody was aware of maps. They were interested in the maps of their places. That's why you see a place like Lake Forest imagined before it really exists, and really having, and why the Lake County is being mapped out in such detail as we're seeing within what, 30 years of the establishment, not even that, of the establishment of the county. There is a tremendous wave of map literacy that's not unlike thinking about public education in the United States in the 19th century, that really governed a very intense period of map use in this country and in several other countries as well. But the United States was really pretty powerful in the way that maps were part of our history in the 19th and early 20th centuries.
All right, we have a couple questions from the public. All right, Dave Henkel wants to know, do we at the History Center and does the Dunn Museum have Lake Forest and Lake Bluff maps for every decade? And I think for the actual village, we have several from 1850 to 1901. Lori, I know that I think we've got stuff all the way through the 1970s in terms of actual original cartographic drawings. And then it moves to with the GIS maps, and it moves to aerial photographs, and you get a whole different level of map making that takes place from that point on. Art?
I was just going to say that for Lake Forest, for instance, and probably for other towns, the phone books that came out, remember phone books? We used to have them, but they would have street maps. And so, like, as you saw the changes in Lake Forest from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s, when there was a lot of development in West Lake Forest, the phone books would show when these streets popped up.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have a map that was done by the Lake County Department of Transportation that starts mapping all of the Lake County roads and what they're made of after they were assigned that responsibility, and they become an entity in the late 30s, and they basically map it out on this one map where they actually just go in and add and change the roadways until 72 when IDOT finally is established and takes over. And it's really fascinating because, you know, there are just random little things. Like, one of the things that the state passed was that if you made your road out of concrete, they were willing to pay for the upkeep, which was a force to create better roadways throughout the counties, because then you knew you didn't have to pay for the upkeep of the road at the county level. All right, and then there's another question from Rami Lopat about, and she's got a fairly long background on this, but it's basically looking at an 1837 settler who came from Pennsylvania, and how would he have gotten from his Temperance Hotel in Chicago to the unsettled wilderness on the Wisconsin-Illinois border? Would he have gone through Waukegan and then west to McHenry? Or would you go to Milwaukee and then Lake Geneva and south? She's never found a map that spanned Lake County and McHenry showing the Indian or wagon trails. Is there one that we know of? We do not have one in our collection, I know that.
I know we have some maps that were later settlers' best guesses of where the Indian trails ran. We obviously don't have anything much earlier, you know, from the 1837 era that would be helpful there.
The county museum the Lake County Historical Society did a map in 1955 that I think had some of those trails, and that was based on earlier research. And there is some volumes of that. I'm far enough retired that I'm not remembering it right this minute, but there were a few scholars who did quite a bit of work on those Indian trails, so that could be figured out.
The base maps that are coming to be in this era are the ones produced by the General Land Office, which are the original plats that were used to lay out the townships. And the Illinois State Library has a full set of these online that you can access, that will show you all the different plats of the townships in Lake County and Cook County during this period. I don't have the URL, the web address, but I think you could just Google Illinois State Library and you could find those. But these wouldn't have been things that would have been widely available to the person who bought that property. Might have seen a plat map, but most likely they would have navigated by word of mouth. That somebody would have said, well, you take this road, which was Waukegan Road, and which would have pre-existed these surveys because it was an Indian trail. And that's how they would have actually navigated out there. But if you're looking to research what was actually there, I don't think there's a single master map that was published or produced that would give you the entire route, but you could research it using these GLO plats.
Great. Any other questions from the public? Anybody who's attending? Got anything you want to put into the chat, or do you want to raise your hand?
Yes. George White, do you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Oh, good. That insert, manuscript insert on the Lake Forest map, the manuscript looks very much like the St. Louis office of William Milburn. He's the same, he was the surveyor of public lands for Illinois and Missouri.
Huh.
And it's the same manuscript as on the Archange maps. When she wanted to sell the sections of land, which are now Wilmette, Evanston, and from the from Lake Street south over to Grosse Pointe Lighthouse. Take a closer look at that, and I'm sure Newberry has a reproduction set of the 1840 maps.
Oh, I was just going to say, there is, for this particular map, you at least can see there's when this went to conservation, were high res copies made. The History Center, the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation, one of the co-sponsors here, the City of Lake Forest, they have copies of that. The Newberry would have a copy of that. And so you could look at that. If it gets down to trying to sort out the materials to see, that would be different. You'd have to look at the original. But I think at least you could see pretty closely on these high-res scans what was going on. I'm not sure what that person's role would have been, but we haven't studied that yet. That's a good question, and something to be pursued. What is the rationale behind all those four clumps of wording on those maps?
Well, take a close look at the manuscript on your map, and also on the maps of the Archange.
Okay.
From 1840. It sure looks like. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you for sharing that. All right. Edith has asked, do we have Lake Bluff in our collection, in our new exhibit, as well as Lake Forest? And the answer is yes, we do. One of the things I love about the framing of our mission is that we do carry for both towns, and the ability to sort of talk about where they are the same in terms of their growth trajectory and then where they differ and why is really fascinating. It's one of the things I think makes the narrative very strong. And it's a great way in looking at these, both to look at the way the land was developed and populated, but then also to look at how it evolves after the first rounds of settlement. It's one of the most fascinating parts, I think, of the exhibit.
I have a question. In the 1861 map of Lake Forest, it shows Depot Avenue stopping at Wisconsin Avenue. There was farms north of Wisconsin Avenue. Was Depot Avenue like a wagon trail, a dirt road? How did the farmers go north of Wisconsin Avenue?
Well, they didn't. I don't think they did. That was open land that hadn't been developed yet. It wasn't purchased as part of the process by the Association in 1856. There would have been an informal route perhaps up that way along on that side of the tracks, but I don't think there was yet a formal. You'd have to look at the county map to see if that gives you any more insight.
Yeah.
And you can buy those pretty cheaply from the Dunn Museum. What is the price of those? It's like $20 or something to get the.
No, I don't remember off the top of my head.
But
yeah.
it's really reasonable. It's like 16 or $20, and you can have this map at home and see, and it would tell you a lot of those kind of things, or you could see more in detail what it was like for getting around in the farm country.
Okay. Was Depot Avenue like a wagon trail at that time, or what?
Well, initially it was a big problem, is what it was. They in Lake Forest, they would let school out for days to go and get the stumps out of the roadways. When they'd cut the trees down, they would have to actually use the kids to help pull the stumps out of the ground. So the roads were theoretical, as Jim said at the beginning. It was an ideal, and they went about trying to make that work. And that's a story. If you actually come back, I'm doing another one, a more detailed thing about the Lake Forest plan in a few weeks, I think, or a couple of weeks.
24th, I believe.
Well, you had the Green Bay Trail, Post Road.
Yeah.
The government road.
But Depot Avenue wasn't part of the original historical part. But people in Rami Lopat knows that there was a farm that developed up there from one of the big old early families, and the Atteridges and things. And so I'm sure they had ways going, but those roads, those farm trails, one of them became Summit Avenue on the other side of the tracks. Actually, Howard Van Doren Shaw drew it into the way around West Park in Lake Forest. And it was he just kind of copied the farm line, the original farm road to the Atteridge house, and built it into his plan. So it took, and that was like 1906. And so that was 50 years later, so it took a while to get things sort of, it wasn't all paved and nice at the start.
Okay. By the way, great presentation. Just a couple other questions. When did McKinley Road come about then?
Well, McKinley died in, what was it, 1901 or was it 1900?
Yeah.
And so when McKinley died, they probably named it after him at that point. Up to that time, Depot Avenue.
Okay, and then so at that point in time, did it go north of Wisconsin Avenue then probably?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd have to look at the maps at each period. There's a 1907 Plat book that would probably show that. And that's what you do. You have a question like that, you look at these maps and you see when names change, when directions or when they're extended. But I think there would have been by probably in that period, because development up that way happened. Certainly there was a stop on the interurban railroad at Noble Avenue by 1899. So there was probably a road up that way.
So I'm going to interrupt because I know that we are now out of time. I want to say that we have maps that will show you all these things.
Okay.
So
Okay.
if you want to wander over to the History Center anytime tomorrow afternoon and any of the days we're open, you can, not only do we have maps hanging on the wall, and we've got some beautiful ones. We have one from 1914. We also have the Sanborn Fire Insurance book out, and we also have the Water Atlas that was printed in 1928. That is a highly detailed map of every street in Lake Forest. So we definitely have the opportunity to explore these stories a little more. Before we lose everybody, I want to make sure that we say thank you to the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation for their support, both for the this lecture this evening, for the transfer of and the preservation of the map that we started with, and for bringing us Art Miller and then the next lecture as well. We've got, over the course of the next several months, not only will we have a series of lectures on topics on all sorts of aspects of maps and the maps that we've got in our collections and others, but we also plan every 3 or 4 weeks of doing pop-up exhibits during the weekend, starting on Friday, where there are maps that are too fragile or too rare to be held out for that entire length of time. So please, if you do not subscribe to our newsletter, do, because you'll get a chance to know what is coming up. I want to say a special thank you to Jim Akerman and the Newberry Library. Just as a little background, Art and I both worked at the Newberry, and so Heather at some point is just going to have to quit her job and go work there. So it
Yeah.
makes it full circle. And to Heather for coming in and talking so nicely about what is a really breathtaking collection for the county at large, which is a critical part of studying immigration, suburbanization, land development, and American history. And with that, I just want to say thank you all, and I look forward to the next lecture. And one of the questions is the next lecture live? I don't know. I will turn that over to Alex to answer. You're on mute, dear.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Is the next lecture live? I don't think we think the next couple are still Zoom, correct?
The next couple are still going to be Zoom. We're hoping to open it up to in-person programs later in the summer, but while we sort of navigate that transition, we're going to stay on Zoom also just for the comfortability of everyone at this point as we sort of see how the summer unfolds. But we're really looking forward to having people in person at the museum tomorrow night, and hopefully we'll be doing programming in person too by the middle or later end of the summer.
Thank you. And we will look forward to the travel exhibit, the map travel exhibit at the Newberry Library next spring.
Yep. Yes.
All right. Thank you all.
Okay.